Imagine this for a moment. It's April 1865. The fighting's finally stopped, mostly. But the feeling of war is still heavy in the air. And picture this scene at a place called Cold Harbor. Nearly a whole year after a terrible battle there, you see African Americans doing this incredibly grim work. They're gathering soldiers' bones, just scattered bones left exposed, trying to give them a proper burial. It's a powerful image, right? It hits you with the sheer brutality of the Civil War. And maybe surprisingly, scenes like that actually helped inspire Memorial Day. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are plunging into the American Civil War, the years 1860 to 1865. And our mission here isn't just to recount the famous battles. We want to really unpack the deep-seated causes, look at how the war aims shifted over time, the huge mobilization efforts, and of course the devastating human cost. This was a war everyone thought would be short, over quickly. But it turned into this 4-year struggle that completely reshaped the country and, well, changed millions of lives forever.
Absolutely. And our goal for you today is to give you a kind of shortcut to understanding the, let's say, the complexities and the real turning points of this absolutely pivotal period in American history. We'll try to boil down the essential insights, maybe some surprising details too, so you walk away feeling genuinely well-informed, because this conflict, its echoes are still with us today.
Okay, so to really get how this whole thing ignited, we need to rewind a bit. Look at the divisions that had been, well, simmering for decades. We often point to Lincoln's election in 1860 as the spark. And it was a turning point, no doubt. But the roots, they go much deeper. So how did his election become that final catalyst?
Well, you're right. It wasn't out of the blue. For decades, you had these outspoken figures in the South, the fire eaters, who were openly threatening to leave the Union. Lincoln's election for them was kind of the last straw. The Republican Party was different. It was explicitly against letting slavery spread into the Western territories. And that stance, it just shocked Southern leaders. It fueled all their existing fears whipped up by abolitionists, especially radical ones like John Brown, who'd already used violence.
So these tensions weren't new, but Lincoln's election was the breaking point after this long buildup. What were those core issues, the irritants that kept widening the gap between North and South?
Yeah, these were old wounds, really. The absolute #1 issue was slavery's expansion westward. This goes way back, Missouri Compromise in 1819, then Texas in the 30s and 40s. It just flared up again really intensely after the Mexican-American War. What do we do with all this new land? Free or slave? That was the burning question.
And the attempts to find a middle ground, they often just made things worse, didn't they? Like the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. What happened there?
Oh, that act was a total disaster. It basically ripped up the old Missouri Compromise line. It introduced this idea of popular sovereignty, let the settlers in the territory decide on slavery themselves.
Sounds democratic on the surface.
Yeah, but in practice, it led directly to bleeding Kansas. You had pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups literally fighting and killing each other out there. It proved popular sovereignty wasn't a solution. It was like fuel on the fire. And around this time, you also have the abolitionist movement really gaining steam. Not a majority view, maybe, but figures like William Lloyd Garrison with his newspaper and radicals like John Brown, they forced the evils of slavery into the national conversation. Hard to ignore.
And all this turbulence inevitably spilled over into politics, right?
Yeah.
How did the political parties shift and react?
Massively. The old parties started to fracture, and new ones popped up specifically around this issue. You had the Liberty Party, then the Free Soil Party, and finally the big one, the Republican Party. All of them, in different ways, were focused on stopping slavery's spread. Southerners saw this as, well, a direct attack, not just on westward expansion, but on their property, their whole way of life.
It really does sound like a collision course. But even as states started leaving after Lincoln's election, were there any last-ditch efforts to compromise? To maybe pull back from the brink?
Amazingly, yes. Even quite late in the game, in December 1860. The most famous was the Crittenden Compromise. Senator Crittenden basically tried to turn back the clock. He proposed constitutional amendments to restore the old Missouri Compromise line, the 36°30' oil line, extend it west, and guarantee slavery couldn't be touched where it already existed. Also protected the slave trade between states.
So why didn't that work? What was the sticking point?
Well, neither side really went for it. Lincoln and the Republicans just couldn't agree to any new expansion of slavery. That was fundamental to their platform. But interestingly, many Southern states also rejected it. Why? Because it didn't guarantee the right to take slaves north of that line or into all territories. It shows how rigid both sides had become. There was even another attempt, the Corwin Amendment, in February '61. It would have made it impossible for Congress ever to abolish slavery in the states. Lincoln actually supported it, trying to reassure the South.
Wow.
But by then, states were already seceding.
Wow.
It was just too little, way too late.
So the path was set. Which states were the first dominoes to fall? How did the Confederacy actually take shape?
South Carolina went first, right after the election, December 20, 1860. Then Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, they followed very quickly in early 61. But it's important to remember, even in those states, it wasn't always a unified decision. The sources say many conventions and votes were extremely divided. These first 7 states then met and formed the Confederate States of America, the CSA, structured as a confederation to emphasize states' rights, particularly, the right to maintain slavery.
And what was the core principle of this new Confederate nation? What did their constitution say?
It looked a lot like the U.S. Constitution in many ways, but with one massive glaring difference. It explicitly stated the nation existed to defend and perpetuate racial slavery and the leadership of the slaveholding class. End quote. It even put it right in there. No, not law impairing or denying the right of property in Negro slaves shall be passed. Very clear. Jefferson Davis became provisional president, Alexander Stephens VP, and later, after the fighting started, 4 more states from the Upper South joined: Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina. They even laid claim to Missouri and Kentucky, though those states were deeply divided and never formally left the Union.
Meanwhile, Lincoln arrives in Washington, February 61. The country is literally falling apart. What's his message in that moment?
His inaugural address, March 4th, 1861, he tried to walk a fine line, conciliatory on one hand, firm on the other. He repeated he had no purpose to interfere with slavery in the states where it exists, trying to calm fears. But he also flatly refused to allow its expansion. And crucially, he stated secession was unconstitutional, illegal. He wouldn't recognize it. That really set the stage for conflict.
And the flashpoint that finally ignited the shooting war was Fort Sumter. What exactly happened there? Why was that the moment?
Fort Sumter was this small Union fort right in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Very vulnerable, surrounded by hostile territory. Lincoln had a choice: try to resupply the garrison and risk war, or abandon it and look weak, maybe even legitimize secession. He chose a middle path: send only food, no weapons or reinforcements, basically daring the Confederates to make the first move.
And they took the bait.
They did. On April 12, 1861, Confederate cannons opened fire. The Union garrison held out for a day and a half, then surrendered. Once that happened, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteer troops from the loyal states to put down the rebellion. The Confederates had fired first, and that act galvanized the North. War was on.
And that call for troops, it forced those remaining southern states, the Upper South and border states, to finally choose.
Exactly. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, they saw Lincoln's call for troops as coercion and voted to secede and join the Confederacy.
But it wasn't monolithic even within those states, was it? Like West Virginia?
Not at all. Large parts of Western Virginia, where there were very few slaveholders, strongly opposed secession. They ended up breaking away from Virginia and forming their own loyal state, West Virginia, which joined the Union in 1863. And there's another interesting angle. Some Native American tribes, particularly the 5 civilized tribes in what's now Oklahoma, actually sided with the Confederacy. They had adopted Southern ways, including slaveholding. But critically for the Union, 4 slave states, Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky, the border states did not secede. Keeping them in the Union was a huge strategic victory for Lincoln, denying the Confederacy crucial population, resources, and territory.
Okay, so war is declared. Both sides initially seem almost cheerful, optimistic it'll be quick. What burst that bubble?
Yeah, there was this widespread belief, North and South, that it would be a short, glorious affair, 90 days maybe, restore the Union or win independence, and everyone goes home. That illusion was completely shattered at the First Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas, as the Confederates called it, in July 1861.
That's the one where people brought picnics to watch.
That's the one. Washington elites, politicians, socialites. They literally rode out with picnic lunches, expecting to see a quick Union rout. Instead, it was a Confederate victory, a pretty chaotic Union retreat. Those onlookers found themselves scrambling back from Virginia along with the soldiers. It was a brutal shock, a sign this was going to be a long, bloody war. Not 90 days, 4 years, as it turned out.
So reality sinks in. How did the two sides actually stack up against each other then? What were the real strengths and weaknesses? Let's do a quick balance sheet.
Well, at first glance, it seems more balanced than you might think later on. The Confederacy definitely had advantages. They were fighting a defensive war, protecting their own territory. That's usually easier. They knew the terrain better, had generally strong support from the white civilian population, and this huge coastline, which made the Union blockade difficult to enforce. initially anyway. Plus, getting the Upper South added manpower and some industry.
But that reliance on cotton, that had to be a weakness, especially with the blockade tightening.
Oh, absolutely. King Cotton diplomacy. The idea that Britain and France needed their cotton, that failed. The blockade choked off exports and imports of vital war materials. They had much less industry than the North, fewer railroads, and they financed the war largely by printing paper money. That led to just crippling runaway inflation later on, and population was a huge factor. Fewer than 9 million people total in the Confederacy, and nearly 4 million of those were enslaved African Americans. So their pool of white manpower for the Army was much, much smaller than the North's, especially as casualties mounted.
Okay, so the Union's advantages were pretty clear then. Numbers, industry.
Yeah, on paper, the Union advantages were huge. Over 20 million people, and immigration continued during the war, adding more manpower. Way more industrial capacity, factories, foundries, textiles, an extensive railroad network to move troops and supplies, and plenty of food production.
But they had downsides too.
Their biggest challenge was strategic. They had to invade the South, conquer it, occupy it. That meant long supply lines, fighting in unfamiliar territory, often against a hostile population. They had to project power over a vast area. That difficulty helps explain why the early years, especially in the Eastern Theater, often felt like a stalemate.
Right. Why was the East so bogged down? McClellan gets a lot of criticism. Meanwhile, things seem to move more in the West for the Union.
Well, part of it was leadership. Many commanders on both sides knew each other from West Point or the Mexican War, so maybe strategies were anticipated. But in the East, you had General George McClellan leading the main Union Army, the Army of the Potomac. And he was just notoriously cautious. Brilliant organizer, maybe, but terrified of taking risks. He constantly thought he was outnumbered, hesitated to attack. That led to failures like the Peninsular Campaign, the 7 Days battles in '62, where he failed to capture the Confederate capital, Richmond. His caution really came to a head at Antietam Creek in Maryland, September 1862.
Antietam, you hear that name and just think. Carnage. The single deadliest day in American combat history. What happened?
It was horrific. Around 8,000 men killed or wounded in one day. McClellan, again, thought Lee's army was much larger than it was. He held back a large part of his own force. So while Lee's invasion of Maryland was stopped, and technically it was a Union victory because Lee retreated, McClellan failed to follow up, failed to potentially destroy Lee's army. It was a bloody, wasted opportunity. Lincoln was exasperated. He apparently said McClellan had the slows and knew he would never win the war.
But as you said, the story was different out West. What was the Union strategy there, and who was making progress?
The West was crucial. The Union strategy was clear. Gain control of the Mississippi River. Split the Confederacy in two, cut off Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana from the rest. And the key Union figure there was Ulysses S. Grant. His Army of the West started grinding out important victories. A really tough one was the Battle of Shiloh in Tennessee, April '62. Huge battle, surprise Confederate attack, massive casualties on both sides. But Grant's forces held on, maintaining that crucial Union foothold deep in the Confederacy. And then the Navy played a huge role too. Admiral David Farragut sailed up the Mississippi and captured New Orleans, the South's biggest city and most important port, in April '62. Then Memphis fell in June. It wasn't just about armies fighting armies anymore. It became about destroying the enemy's capacity and even their will to continue the fight. Total war meant targeting not just soldiers, but also the resources that supported them: railroads, factories, farms. It blurred that line between military and civilian targets, aiming to demoralize the entire population. And alongside this, you see both governments, North and South, expanding their power dramatically, reaching into citizens' lives in ways unimaginable before the war, mobilizing everything.
Let's look at the Confederacy first. How did they handle this mobilization, especially given their whole ideology was based on states' rights? Seems like a contradiction.
It absolutely was a huge contradiction. The central government in Richmond ended up exercising enormous power, far more than many states' rights advocates were comfortable with. They instituted the first national military draft in American history, April 1862. All white men aged 18 to 35 later expanded, and this caused huge resentment. Wealthy men could hire a substitute to fight for them, or were exempted if they owned enough slaves. Rich man's war, poor man's fight became a common complaint. The government also took control of industries, seized railroads, even impressed enslaved people from plantations to work on fortifications, often against the owner's wishes.
And the economic impact on the Confederacy. You mentioned inflation earlier.
It was devastating. The Confederate Congress was reluctant to tax wealth directly, especially slaves or cotton exports, so they just printed money. Huge amounts of paper money, not backed by much. The result? Runaway inflation. prices for basic goods soared. By 1863, there were food riots in Richmond, the capital. Thousands of hungry people, the sources say, mostly women, protesting. President Davis actually threatened to have troops fire on them. And their big diplomatic hope that King Cotton would force Britain and France to intervene. That gamble failed completely. They found other cotton sources and weren't keen to fight the U.S. The Confederacy was increasingly isolated and economically strangled.
So while the South is struggling with internal divisions and a collapsing economy, how is the North mobilizing? They seem to have handled it more effectively.
Much more effectively, largely due to their existing advantages. The federal government in Washington expanded its power and reach enormously. The Republicans in Congress were very active. They implemented new taxes, including the first income tax, tax on inheritances, high tariffs on imported goods. They created a national banking system with the National Bank Acts to help finance the war through bonds. And they printed paper money too, the greenbacks. But because the northern economy was so much stronger and diverse, inflation was less severe, and the economy actually boomed in many sectors during the war. They also passed really significant legislation shaping the future. The Homestead Act in 1862, encouraging westward settlement, funding for a transcontinental railroad. The Morrill Act, setting aside land for agricultural and technical colleges, all tied to this Republican vision of free labor and national development.
Did the Union also resort to a draft? And what about civil liberties, like habeas corpus?
Yes. The Union implemented its own draft, the Enrollment Act, in March 1863. And it had similar controversial loopholes. You could pay a $300 fee to avoid service or hire a substitute. Again, fueling resentment. Interestingly, African Americans were explicitly exempted from this draft initially because the Dred Scott Supreme Court decision had said they weren't citizens. As for civil liberties, Lincoln took controversial steps. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus, the right to challenge unlawful detention for selectively in Maryland in 61 and 62, then nationwide in 1863. This allowed the military to arrest and detain suspected Confederate sympathizers or spies without trial. His administration even shut down around 300 newspapers deemed disloyal or harmful to the war effort. These were drastic measures, showing how the war expanded government power in the North, too.
And while the governments are mobilizing and men are fighting, women are stepping into crucial roles back home, right? On both sides.
Absolutely indispensable. With so many men away fighting, women took over farms, plantations, businesses. They became the primary managers of the home front economy. They also organized constantly, forming ladies' aid societies, sewing uniforms, knitting socks, raising funds, sending supplies to the troops. Many women volunteered with organizations like the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which worked to improve hygiene and medical care in army camps, drastically reducing deaths from disease, which actually killed more soldiers than combat did. And women like Dorothea Dix became superintendents of nurses. Thousands served as nurses, closer to the front lines than women had ever been before. Some were even spies or disguised themselves as men to fight. It was a period of huge change and challenge for women's roles.
Okay, so alongside this massive mobilization, there's another fundamental shift happening.
Yeah.
The war's objective starts moving towards ending slavery. Lincoln's position evolved significantly here, didn't it?
It really did. Initially, his absolute main goal was just preserving the Union. He was very cautious about the slavery issue, fearing it would alienate the border states or Northern Democrats. He famously wrote in August 1862, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or destroy slavery." A very clear middle-of-the-road stance at that point.
So what changed his mind, or forced his hand?
Several things. One was the reality on the ground. Thousands upon thousands of enslaved people were freeing themselves by escaping to Union Army lines. What should the Army do with them? Generals like Benjamin Butler started calling them contrabands of war enemy property that could be seized. They weren't returned to their owners. This was a practical way to weaken the Confederacy by depriving it of labor. Congress also started chipping away. The Confiscation Acts of 61 and 62 allowed seizure of property, including slaves, used for the Confederate war effort. They abolished slavery in Washington, D.C., banned it in the territories. The pressure was building.
And that leads to the Emancipation Proclamation. It's such a landmark, but often misunderstood. What did it actually do, and what was its real impact?
All right, it's crucial to get the details. Lincoln actually issued a preliminary proclamation after the Battle of Antietam in September 62. It was basically an ultimatum to the rebellious states. Rejoin the Union by January 1st, 1863, or their slaves would be declared free.
And the Confederacy ignored it.
Of course. So on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issued the final Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that all persons held as slaves within any state or part of a state in rebellion against the United States shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. The key things to note, it only applied to states currently in rebellion. It did not apply to the loyal border states, like Kentucky, Maryland, or to Confederate areas already under Union control, like parts of Tennessee, Virginia, Louisiana.
So it didn't immediately free all enslaved people everywhere.
No, it didn't. Freedom often depended on the arrival of the Union Army, but its impact was still immense. It dramatically shifted the objective of the war increasingly toward ending slavery. It turned the Union Army into an army of liberation, at least in principle. It thrilled abolitionists and African Americans. It enraged the Confederacy, and it really divided the North.
We hear about the draft riots in New York City.
Exactly. While many Northerners supported emancipation, many others, especially working-class whites and immigrants, feared that freed slaves would come north and compete for jobs. There was intense racial hatred. This exploded in the New York City draft riots in July 1863, just after the draft lottery started there. It wasn't just about the draft became a vicious race riot. White mobs, largely Irish immigrants, attacked draft offices, wealthy Republicans, and brutally targeted African Americans. They lynched people, burned homes, even destroyed an orphanage for black children. Over 100 people were killed, mostly black New Yorkers. It's estimated a fifth of the city's black population fled in terror. It was a terrible reminder of the deep racism and division that existed even within the Union.
But despite those terrible riots, 1863 militarily was a huge turning point for the Union, wasn't it? What were the key victories?
Absolutely. July 1863 was arguably the turning point of the war. While the riots were happening in New York, Union armies won two massive victories almost simultaneously. First, out west, Grant finally captured Vicksburg, Mississippi after a long, difficult siege. The city fell on July 4th, incredibly symbolic.
Vicksburg's fall gave the Union control of the Mississippi.
Complete control. It's put the Confederacy geographically. Texas, Arkansas, western Louisiana were cut off. It was a strategic catastrophe for the South. Residents in Vicksburg had been reduced to hiding in caves and apparently ate their pets to survive the siege. Its fall was huge.
And at almost the exact same time, way up north in Pennsylvania, the Battle of Gettysburg was raging.
Right. Lee had decided to invade the North again, hoping to relieve pressure on Vicksburg. Maybe capture a major northern city, demoralize the Union, perhaps even win foreign recognition. It led to this massive three-day battle near the small town of Gettysburg, July 1st to 3rd. It became the biggest and costliest battle ever fought in North America, just enormous scale.
And the climax was Pickett's charge.
On the third day, July 3rd, Lee ordered a massive frontal assault on the center of the Union line, Pickett's charge. It was incredibly brave but disastrous. The Confederates marched across nearly a mile of open field under withering Union fire. Sources say more than half lost their lives or were wounded or captured. It was a devastating repulse. Lee's army was shattered and forced to retreat back to Virginia.
So Vicksburg falls July 4th, Gettysburg ends July 3rd. Twin disasters for the Confederacy.
Exactly. Happening basically on the same day. It broke the Confederacy's offensive capability. They were largely on the defensive for the rest of the war. The momentum had decisively shifted to the Union.
And a few months later, Lincoln goes to Gettysburg to dedicate the cemetery there and delivers maybe the most famous speech in American history, the Gettysburg Address. Only 2 minutes long.
Just about 2 minutes, yeah. But incredibly powerful. He wasn't just dedicating a cemetery, he was redefining the war's purpose. He connected the soldiers' sacrifice back to the nation's founding principles in the Declaration of Independence and Equality. He said they died so the nation might have a new birth of freedom. And he framed the war as a test of whether democratic government of the people, by the people, for the people could survive. It elevated the struggle beyond just preserving the Union to preserving democracy and achieving equality. Profound.
So heading into 1864, the tide has clearly turned. The Union's mobilization is really hitting its stride. You mentioned standardized rails, the economy humming along. How stark was the contrast with the Confederacy by then?
Oh, the contrast was becoming incredibly stark. The Union had the manpower, the industry, the logistics to sustain this grinding war effort. They could replace losses, equip armies, move supplies relatively efficiently. The Confederacy, on the other hand, was bleeding out. Critical manpower shortages. Their railroad system was breaking down. The blockade was strangling their economy. Food shortages were widespread. Inflation was out of control. Morale was plummeting on the home front. And their hopes for help from Europe were completely gone.
Right, you mentioned Britain and France didn't come through. Why not, ultimately?
Well, several reasons. The Emancipation Proclamation made it politically very difficult for Britain, which had abolished slavery itself decades before, to support a slaveholding confederacy. Plus, they found other cotton sources in Egypt and India. They also didn't want war with the United States. France, under Napoleon III, had its own ambitions. He actually tried to install a French-backed emperor in Mexico while the U.S. was distracted by the Civil War, but that didn't translate into helping the Confederacy fight the Union. They were on their own.
And this is also when we see large numbers of African-American soldiers really making an impact in the Union Army.
Yes, a major development. After the Emancipation Proclamation officially authorized it, the Union began actively recruiting black soldiers. Over 190,000 African-American men served in the Union Army and Navy by the war's end.
What was their experience like? They faced discrimination even within the Union ranks, right?
Absolutely. Deep-seated racism was still prevalent in the North and in the Army. Many black regiments were initially used primarily for manual labor, digging trenches, hauling supplies, rather than combat. They were often paid less than white soldiers until Congress finally equalized pay in 1864. They faced prejudice from white soldiers and officers. But when given the chance to fight, they proved their courage and dedication time again. Regiments like the famous 54th Massachusetts Volunteers distinguished itself at Fort Wagner in South Carolina, leading a valiant assault against heavy odds. Their bravery helped change some white attitudes.
But the Confederacy's attitude towards black soldiers was brutal. Fort Pillow.
Utterly brutal. The Confederacy refused to recognize captured black soldiers as prisoners of war. Their policy was often to execute them or return them to slavery. The most notorious incident was the massacre at Fort Pillow, Tennessee, in April 1864. Confederate troops under General Nathan Bedford Forrest, who later became a founder of the KKK, overran the fort and are documented as having executed scores of surrendered Union soldiers, particularly African Americans. This atrocity outraged the North and led Lincoln's government to halt all prisoner exchanges with the Confederacy for a time, which actually worsened conditions for prisoners on both sides.
Okay, so 1864, 1865, Grant is now in command of all Union armies. What's his strategy to finally end this?
Grant understood the math. The Union had superior numbers and resources. His strategy was relentless pressure, simultaneous offensives, grinding down Lee's army in Virginia while Sherman attacked in the Deep South. He knew it would be bloody. His 1864 Virginia campaign, the Battles of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, involved horrific fighting and staggering Union casualties, huge losses. Northern morale dipped significantly. People called Grant a butcher.
But he kept pushing.
He kept pushing. He understood that the Union could afford those losses, tragically, in a way the Confederacy couldn't. His relentless advance finally forced Lee into a defensive position around Petersburg, a vital rail hub supplying Richmond. Grant then began a long siege of Petersburg, essentially trapping Lee's army and cutting off the Confederate capital. This lasted for 9 brutal months.
And while Grant is pinning Lee down in Virginia, General Sherman is marching through the Deep South, the famous March to the Sea.
This was the other prong of Grant's strategy. Sherman captured Atlanta in September 1864. That victory was huge. It reversed the North's sinking morale right before the presidential election.
And then the march itself. A scorched earth policy.
Yes. After taking Atlanta, Sherman cut loose from his supply lines and marched his army 300 miles across Georgia to Savannah on the coast. His explicit goal was to destroy the South's ability to wage war and to demoralize the South by bringing the war home to civilians. His troops destroyed railroads, burned crops, seized livestock, looted homes. Accounts like Dolly Sumner Luntz describe the utter devastation. It was total war, aimed at breaking the Southern spirit. After reaching Savannah, Sherman turned north, marching through South Carolina, the cradle of secession, inflicting even harsher destruction. They captured Charleston, burned the capital, Columbia, and kept heading north to eventually link up with Grant's forces in Virginia.
And all this intense fighting is happening during Lincoln's reelection campaign in 1864. That must have been a tough race for him.
It was incredibly tough. Lincoln faced huge opposition. Many Democrats and even some Republicans saw him as a dictator because of things like suspending habeas corpus and the draft. Many white Northerners intensely disliked the Emancipation Proclamation and the use of black soldiers. The racism we saw in the draft riots was still a potent force. His opponent was George B. McClellan, the popular general he had fired.
So how did Lincoln pull off the win?
Early on, Lincoln himself thought he would probably lose. But then came those key Union military victories, especially Sherman taking Atlanta. That dramatically boosted Northern morale and confidence in Lincoln's leadership. Soldiers in the field also voted overwhelmingly for Lincoln. He won a decisive victory in the Electoral College, carrying all but 3 states. It was a mandate to finish the war and see through emancipation.
So by the spring of 1865, the end is near for the Confederacy. How did it finally collapse?
It really crumbled quickly in those final months. With Sherman marching north through the Carolinas and Grant tightening the noose around Petersburg and Richmond, Lee's situation was hopeless. Most major cities, ports, industrial centers were gone. On April 2, 1865, Grant finally broke through the Petersburg lines. Lee was forced to abandon both Petersburg and the capital, Richmond, which fell the next day. Lee tried to escape west with his dwindling army, hoping to link up with other Confederate forces, but Grant's army pursued relentlessly.
Leading to Appomattox.
Yes. On April 9, 1865, Lee, his army starving and surrounded, with fewer than 35,000 men left facing Grant's force of over 100,000, surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia.
Was that the official end?
It was the main event, signaling the end. The remaining Confederate forces surrendered over the next few weeks. General Joseph Johnston surrendered his large army to Sherman in North Carolina on April 19, 1865. That pretty much marked the official end of the fighting.
And the cost of it all, just staggering.
Unimaginably devastating. The most common estimate is more than 600,000 soldiers killed on both sides. That's more American soldiers than died in World War I and World War II combined, in a country with a much smaller population. Countless others were wounded, physically and psychologically scarred for life. Thousands of women were left widowed, families shattered. The South's economy and infrastructure were destroyed. The nation was left with this immense task of healing, rebuilding, and figuring out what reunification actually meant.
Which brings us to the end of this deep dive. It's almost hard to comprehend the scale of the transformation. A war that started to preserve the Union ended up abolishing slavery and completely redefining America.
Absolutely. The war ended slavery, preserved the Union, but it left behind these profound questions about reconciliation, justice, equality. How do you bring a shattered nation back together? And maybe the thought to leave you with is this. If the Civil War cost so much blood and treasure to try and define what one nation indivisible truly meant, what echoes of those divisions over race, over states' rights, over the meaning of freedom and equality do you think still linger in our society today? How does really grappling with this period help us understand the complexities we still face now?